Hi, I'm Catherine Dean Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I'm coming to you live from Nashville because of some travel hiccups. So I apologize for any background noise. This is the last in our series of Fridays for Life that we've been doing since Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. And today we have John McCormick from National Review and the National Review Institute joining us to talk about his most recent article in National Review and to talk about what happened in Kansas this week and the battle, the post-Roe battle in the states. John, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Can you talk a little bit about Kansas? Because I think that's probably why most people are clicking on here right now. What on earth happened?
There's no denying it was a big loss for the pro-life movement in the state. Just a little background here. This was a ballot measure that was precipitated by a 2019 state Supreme Court ruling. Back in 2019, the Kansas Supreme Court held that the state contains within it a fundamental right to abortion, dating all the way back to 1859, because it includes language basically echoing the Declaration of Independence. This set off an effort by Republicans, pro-lifers in the legislature, to get this ballot on the to be held in 2022 initiative, saying that there is no right to abortion in the Kansas Constitution. It didn't say what would replace it. It would just overturn that decision, and then the legislature would be free to enact further restrictions or not. In the wake of Dobbs, I think that it was really a big mistake for the pro-life movement not to present the clear alternative of what exactly the legislature would do. That let the media and their opponents fill in the blanks. And now many of the claims were false or misleading. Pro-lifers, Republicans, legislators didn't have a clear response to what they were going to do. So there were a lot of advertisements saying, reasonably asking, will there be, the exception for the case of rape? Very supermajority of Americans nationwide support that exception, which accounts for less than 1% of all abortions. Then there were questions about, could the life of the mother exception, will that be there? Now that is in every state law. There's always been a life of the mother exception. It's been in every state law before Roe. It's been in every state law. It's been triggered since Dobbs. There's been some disinformation, misinformation out there, which I think contributed to the environment in which this ballot measure failed, 41% to 59%. But at the end of the day, one very a big part of the story here is that there were a lot of Republicans in Kansas, and this is a historical thing that in Kansas there are a fair amount of Republicans who support a right to abortion, and so you could see this in the returns. There were 467,000 Republicans voted in the Senate primary, but only 373,000 Kansans voted yes on the ballot initiative, saying that there was not a right to abortion. So that means something on the order of 90,000-ish people voted in the Republican primary, but then did not vote yes on the ballot. It did not vote yes to say that there was no right to abortion in the Constitution in Kansas.
First of all, I should let everyone know that we have an editorial on National Review Online about the lessons of Kansas. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind as this all shifts to the state, don't we, is that, as is pointed out in the editorial, Dobbs did not end Roe. And Dobbs did not also automatically explain to everyone what the pro-life movement is, what basic medical care is. And as you write about in the print magazine, the more media misinformation, confusion in some cases. I think that there are some cases of people just being genuinely confused about what basic medical care is and what actually happens in hospitals. But the more we have this sort of media monsoon about ectopic pregnancies and all of the rest, you're actually seeing a shift where medical review boards and ethics boards are actually becoming gun shy, even though the law is not telling them that they have to not care for women who have ectopic pregnancies, for example. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on here that the media echo chamber definitely is having an impact, and false claims about whether ectopic pregnancies would be treated. Now that in many state laws in most states, that's as explicit as the law gets. It says we don't even consider treatment for ectopic pregnancies, or it's very clear based on reading the statute that it's not even included in the life. We're gonna go a step beyond saying there's life of the mother exception. Say this isn't even constitute abortion, and many medical experts would agree with that. That an ectopic pregnancy is when a human embryo it implants outside the womb. The baby can never survive to viability, the point at which it could survive outside the womb. And doctors, whenever they detect it, they treat it, and life-saving treatment for the mother always results in the death of the unborn embryo, the unborn baby. And we don't need to get in the theology here, but the principle of double effect is at play, where you're not directly targeting the baby as you would in induced abortion. But that's never been in doubt, and there are just a handful of stories about that there is some confusion here. It's not even clear how many places that's happened. Ectopic pregnancies do account for 1 or 2% of all pregnancies. So I think if there were widespread confusion about this, we would hear a lot more stories about this. But the fact that there are any stories is just inexcusable. I mean, there's women in these situations should be given immediate care. There should be no question about whether there should be a delay of treatment. And the law is very clear on this. The same is true with treating a woman who has miscarried, where her baby has died. That's explicitly excluded from the definition of abortion in Texas law and most laws. But I talked to this doctor, pro-life doctor down in Texas, Ingrid Scott. She said she has heard from trusted colleagues. I couldn't get anyone on the phone specifically who had seen this, but where some, emergency room that said, no, we're not going to treat you. Wait for this to pass on, which is horrible. That's substandard care. That should not be happening. And then there are also cases now where we have seen, this is where maybe a layperson wouldn't immediately know what the truth is here, but there are cases also where, as Dr. Scott would say, a woman's membranes rupture, her water breaks before viability, and that very likely will lead to an infection, which will very likely could lead to a potentially fatal sepsis. And now Dr. Scott says that it is the standard of care to offer early induction to deliver that baby at 17 weeks to save the life of the mother, that there's no requirement to wait until that situation gets more dangerous. The life-threatening situation is on day one, and where it's appropriate to offer that induction immediately. But there have been some reports now out of Texas that, well, actually over the last 11 months, some hospitals have changed their standards of care, waiting until the situation becomes worse. And that shouldn't be happening. We didn't hear a lot of these stories over the last 11 months. That's a little bit, one of the surprising things is that Texas has had this heartbeat law in effect since September 1st of 2021. And there were not a lot of these stories. There was one anonymous story of an ectopic pregnancy that was not treated back in October of 2021. An anonymous story. There weren't a lot of those stories, so I was skeptical of those. But there apparently was a change at some major hospitals with this other scenario, and that shouldn't be happening. So you're hearing a lot of these stories now come out in the press. I think that Dr. Scott says she's heard more anecdotes in other cases since Dobbs, meaning that this media, which leads her to believe that's evidence that the media echo chamber is having some effect. It wasn't merely the change in the law. But over the past 11 months, there have been almost zero doctors sued under Texas's heartbeat law, which allows these civil lawsuits. The only case that the president of Texas Right to Life is aware of is a doctor who wrote a Washington Post op-ed in September 21 saying that he had performed an abortion, which it suggested at least that he had performed an abortion that was illegal or not allowed under Texas's SB 8 law, the Texas Heartbeat Act, the civil law. So there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. Pro-life journalist Alexander DeSanctis had a very good piece just pulling out all the legislation. The Charlotte Lozier Institute, which is the research arm of the Susan B. Anthony list. Dr. Scott is a senior fellow there. They wrote a very good paper just highlighting that there are these rare but real cases where the pregnant mother's life is in danger. Here's a standard of care. Every state law in the country allows a standard of care. And I really think that you would hopefully want everyone in the country on either side of this debate to come together and say, let's clarify this. Let's make this clear to everyone that this is allowed, that this life-saving treatment is allowed. It's allowed immediately. There's no requirement to wait, but there's a lot of disinformation. I think some of it's deliberate, some of it's unintentional. The ideological motive here obviously would be there's an ideological motive to say, you either have to allow abortion through all 9 months with the doctor saying it's necessary for the mother's emotional or mental health. That's the binary choice I want to set up. Either you give us this expansive right to abortion, we say whatever goes, versus, and if you don't let us have that, we're going to sow doubt and confusion about whether this treatment can be given immediately. I don't think that that's all deliberate. I think there's some genuine confusion mixed in, along with the practice of defensive medicine. Now, in this case, we're talking about defensive medicine of fear of a lawsuit, in Texas in particular, fear of a $10,000 lawsuit. But the fear of medical malpractice should also be on their minds. I would hope that that any woman who's been given substandard care, when that care is in fact legal, would sue. And I know and I also think that ultimately this will come down to people in positions of authority, people like attorneys general, governors, even if necessary, legislators should step in and say, this is our law never meant this. Most of these laws leave it to reasonable medical judgment because they don't want to tie doctors' hands when there are real physical health issues, and there are no two cases are necessarily exactly alike. They don't want to begin enumerating every specific thing, but I think there's no reason why Attorney General couldn't say, they should be saying, doctors are legally free to use the same standards of medical judgment and care in cases such as, but not limited to, severe hypertension, these cases of infections, things like that. So there's a lot of work to be done. That this is the environment that we are in right now, and it's very important to protect the lives of women, for the sake of the pro-life laws, for both, that you want these to be clarified as quickly as possible. And I would hope people on both sides of this debate could agree upon that.
Yeah, one of the points you just kind of intimated was, this needs to be more than about politics and ideology. And if people actually care for women and women's health, then we can actually look at the facts and not invent facts and not try to scare people. And of course, that's a very hard thing to do in such a frenzied political environment. But that's why it's so important that you and Alexander DeSanctis and other people at National Review and elsewhere fact check, and really talk about what the law actually says, talk about what is actually happening. The interviewing doctors is really important, and she's far from the only doctor who will give the same testimony and has given similar testimony. Peggy Noonan has a column today sort of telling Republicans they really need to mature on this issue. When we talk about the pro-life movement, there's the pro-life movement, the people who most Americans don't know about, who are doing the front lines work at women's care centers and have been going to the March for Life for all these years since Roe versus Wade became law because of the Supreme Court inventing history, law, science. How can the Republican Party stop making unforced errors, saying cruel things, that don't help in this environment where people are scared? And one of the points we always make at National Review is the poll numbers that make clear that most people are with us. Most people they don't want abortion on demand without apology. They want restrictions, they want protections for innocent life, especially later on in the pregnancy. Are Republicans making a mistake wanting all or nothing? And how can Republicans do a better job to serve women and children and themselves politically better?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, Peggy Noonan, she pointed to a few different things in her column today. One was this disgusting, callous, mean-spirited comment from Florida Republican Matt Gaetz, who is a mean-spirited person who says awful things. Republicans should stop electing people like that if they want people who actually care about women and babies and they want to advance their cause in the in the public sphere, in the public square, they should stop electing people like him. I have very little hope that they'll be doing that. But I think that's all the more reason that the good people need to speak up, that people who are in the overwhelming majority who are humane, decent and kind need to speak up. I think that obviously Kansas does point in the direction that, it was a 50-year fight to overturn Dobbs, which merely restored the ability to have this debate in a meaningful sense in the first place. And the debate will go on for many more decades. There's not going to be some quick all or nothing resolution. Some states will go to, basically just a ban with a life of the mother exception. Other states are codifying their, abortion through 9 months, which is horrendous. I mean, we're really talking about infanticide. After 21 weeks, these babies are born. They're patients in the neonatal intensive care unit. It's the exact same baby, at 23 weeks in that hospital living, with medical assistance, as that is the baby in the womb. And that's going on. That's continuing to go on. And Republicans and pro-lifers should not lose sight of the fact that they should highlight the extremism of the other side. That basically every single Democrat in Congress has voted for a bill that would effectively make abortion legal throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. Like, again, if a doctor simply invokes an emotional and mental health exception, and it's all up to him. Abortion past viability is legal in every state. It's not even a doctor; it's a healthcare provider in this term. So it could be a midwife or a nurse practitioner. It's not defined in the law, in the bill legislation. Every Democrat in Congress supports unlimited taxpayer funding of abortion throughout pregnancy. And that's deeply unpopular too. But Republicans again have to realize they don't want to give the electorate this choice between two deeply unpopular positions: one of extremism on the left, and just according to what the polls say, most voters do believe in the typical exceptions that we talked about earlier. So I do think that in Kansas in particular, that I think if they do want to take another attempt at a vote in the future, they're going to need to say, we are paring back this Supreme Court ruling, and we're going to put in a limit at 12 weeks or 6 weeks, the heartbeat, whatever, and we include the exceptions, the standard exceptions. I think that would be a prudent next step. But it's different in every state, and again, at this point in time, it is probably it's a very difficult time to have a reasoned debate. But this does point to the direction that Republicans, they need to be principled and incremental. But also, I think that another mistake could be putting their heads in the sand and not giving a position, right? So if Republicans in Congress just say, they bury their heads in the sand and say, oh, they mumble something about it's up to the states now, and they can't say that, well, I'm for, which they all are. They've all voted for the 20-week pain capable bill. I think the 20-week pain capable bill is legislation that would ban abortion except in rare circumstances, those rare exceptions, after 20 weeks of pregnancy or so, when a baby can feel pain. There's been an increasing amount of medical evidence that perhaps as early as, I believe, 13 weeks, babies might be able to feel pain. So I think there's movements among some pro-lifers to say, if we're going to have this legislation, it should be at least 15 weeks. But that's one place where you're on the side. The majority of the country is on your side. I mean, the abortion law in France is at 14 weeks. This would be at 15 weeks. Everybody has Google. Everybody has seen ultrasounds. Everybody knows that's a baby. I mean, obviously, as pro-lifers, we know that it's still a baby in the embryonic stages. But when someone intuitively with their own eyes sees a picture, they realize on a sort of a gut level, an intuitive level, of course, that's a baby at 15 weeks. So I think that it's an incremental position. So yeah, so Republicans both, they need to be prudent, but they need to give something. They need to give something clear. They need to give some answer, because if they don't define their position, the Democrats will define their position, and the media will define their position, and oftentimes dishonest ways.
I do think one thing that is really important for Republicans to realize is that as you just said, a sonogram makes clear what's going on. But for 49 years, our culture and our laws have lied about that, and so to immediately want a purist position is just it's silly, because it's not going to succeed in many states. And so you and I are both pro-lifers who want to see no abortion, but we also are realistic human beings and know that in some states, an incremental approach is absolutely essential at this moment, before the culture has really changed hearts and minds, as we say, right? What are there best case scenarios in terms of politicians who you would hold up as examples of people who have the right messaging because their heart's in the right place? I mean, I think of a Democrat, Dan Lipinski, who was voted out by Emily's List in the Democratic Party because he was pro-life. I want to see more Democratic pro-lifers because this shouldn't be an issue for that one party has a hold on. There should be some competition for pro-life voters, you know. But is there any way you would highlight as sort of the right messenger?
I think Ben Sass has struck a right tone about, speaking about compassion. He's the sponsor of the Born Alive Infant Survivors Act. I think in terms of, sort of this prudent legislative stuff, this principled incrementalism, I would actually point to, Georgia is one example where I think that, sorry, I could step back a second. One point of hopeful, one sign of hope or a glimmer of hope, I would say, for the pro-life movement here. I'll make an analogy here to a referendum that took place back in 2011. It had nothing to do with abortion. It was in Ohio. There was a referendum on collective bargaining. And this was back, remember, there was this big fight in Wisconsin and Ohio about whether or not they'd pair back collective bargaining rights for public employee unions. In Ohio, they didn't include an exception for police and firefighters. And that law never went into effect. Voters repealed it something like 62% to 38%. Now, basically the same law with an exception for firefighters and police officers took effect in Wisconsin. It went into effect for a year. It worked. The sky didn't fall. There was an effort to remove Scott Walker. There was no ballot initiative, but there was an effort to move Scott Walker. He won his recall race by 7 percentage points. He won re-election again a couple of years later. So that's a point where, sometimes maybe there's an analogy there where voters are scared of the unknown. There weren't the exceptions. A referendum and an election are not necessarily the same thing. And so I would bring that back to something like Georgia. Georgia right now is basically the midpoint state in our elections. Last time around, it was the state that decided the Senate. It was one of the 3 states that decided the presidency. Brian Kemp has been a sort of stalwart conservative. He passed the Texas law, so banning abortion very early in pregnancy, 6 weeks at the heartbeat. It does have the rape exception in it. If Kemp wins and Herschel Walker, who is a candidate who has a lot of challenges, a lot of baggage, I think that'll be pretty clear evidence that the abortion issue was not alone the reason that if Republicans do end up underperforming this November. If Brian Kemp wins, I think that'll be a sign that, yes, even in a battleground state, you can sign principled pro-life legislation that has, that does a lot to save a lot of lives, a lot of babies, and that you can win. That you've passed a law that can be secured and sustained by public opinion, right? You want to pass a law. You don't want to pass. If you have the vote today that you pass a law that 80% of the population is going to oppose and repeal in a year versus via, legislative elections or referenda, that's not very wise as a matter of political prudence. So I think Georgia is a real place that I would look to just in terms of did that principled incrementalism, is that a successful model? In Georgia, I would look there. But yeah, I think that in terms of messaging, I'm not really the best person to talk about messaging. I'm more of the sort of policy and politics guy.
Well, first of all, if you're watching live, you can put questions in the chat box. Feel free to do that, and we'll weave it into the conversation. John, can you talk about why you do reporting on this issue in particular? One of the things that I love about you is your persistence in hostile environments, trying to make politicians like Nancy Pelosi be coherent in their talk about policy on this issue. What brought you to that place, and what keeps you there?
Well, thank you. When I talk to young people, I try not to be too make them feel too naive or be too hokey, but I always say, what's the point of journalism, right? Why do we do this? And I think the best answer is that you're trying to tell stories that matter, and stories that wouldn't be told if, at least some of them wouldn't be told if you weren't there to tell them. I also say if you ask questions that no one else is asking, you'll write stories that no one else is writing. And so especially on Capitol Hill, there are a lot of reporters I respect. Don't get me wrong, even at mainstream outlets, but this is just a story where the the actual premises of one side of the debate are almost never questioned. Capitol Hill, you'll get a lot of sort of horse race coverage, a lot of procedural coverage, and the premises of conservatives are often questioned, but not of the other side. I mean, I'm a National Review. I don't try to hide the fact that that I'm a conservative. I'm a National Review, Reaganite conservative. I'm pro-life. I've been pro-life since sometime before the age of 11, I think. I remember I definitely was very concerned about how my parents were going to vote in the 1996 elections. So yeah, my parents were pro-life, both my mom and my dad. My mom lost her first child to stillbirth, and she went to a silent protest of Roe. After that, she said, they feel pain. These are babies. So I always grew up in an environment like that, where it's sort of just obvious that these are babies, and we have this barbaric law in our country. We had it embedded in our constitutional jurisprudence with the Supreme Court for 49 years, and now it's embedded in many state laws. It's being pursued at the congressional level. And so if there are opportunities for me to ask questions about the Hyde Amendment or this, I want to ask them, because another cliche of journalism is speaking truth to power, and well, who is less powerful than an unborn child? So that's another reason I ask these questions. Again, I think they're fair questions. They're tough questions to ask both sides. I think I'd be happy to have more competition running around Washington asking these questions sometimes, or asking political candidates on the campaign trail these questions. But yeah, this is a deeply morally serious issue. It's a very difficult issue too. It's obviously it's the Declaration of Independence, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the right to life versus what many view as a very important right to liberty, right? So when those two rights collide, there's always a question, as Justice Kavanaugh said, at any given moment, one of those rights is going to win out. So this is a difficult and important issue, and so I've been very lucky to have places like National Review and the Weekly Standard before that that allowed me to ask these questions.
And you talk about policy, John. One thing that Republicans need to take up in a big way is crafting legislation and policy that will help women and children. And some, Mitt Romney and others, Mark Rubio, have put forth some proposals for paid family leave. I personally think that we need to invest. The government's going to use money, so let's make sure we're putting it into community health centers and things that will help women who are in desperate situations, because the reality is there are a lot of low-income women who feel like they have no choice but an abortion. And when we think about Republican politicians, I keep thinking about Elizabeth Warren and how much traction she's getting with her desire to shut down women's care centers, crisis pregnancy centers. Part of why she gets so much traction is, right, it's easy to just make an assertion that these centers that are all sort of independently operated in many cases, and you can't generalize about what they do, but just in the last couple of days, I've been in Nashville for a convention, and between meetings and things, I've visited one ministry that deals with adoption, that literally gives money away, a Christian faith-based ministry to help with adoption, couples with adoption, and also if there are medical or other needs, which there often are. With children, especially from foster care, they'll give grants to help with the costs. We need more things like that. I also visited a mobile care unit, which an ultrasound is a game changer if the mother is able to see that this is a child, which is not probably what you're going to hear at Planned Parenthood. Republicans need to step up to the plate and highlight the good, and also support the good.
Yeah. You mentioned that Mitt Romney has introduced that legislation. It would increase a child tax credit. It would allow it to begin several months before birth. So it really does provide that critical time. It would provide funding. It also does it in deficit neutral way, so it wouldn't contribute to inflation. You can still be responsible, fiscally responsible here. It's very unlikely that there's going to be any appetite for that in the Democratic Party right now. It pays for it by getting rid of the rest of the $10,000 deduction. That's not $10,000 in savings, but $10,000 deducted off of your taxable income for state and local income taxes. A lot of blue state Democrats just say that that's a non-starter. That's their constituency. Obviously, if you have kids, people would still be better off net. But it's a really serious proposal, and I think it's more of a long-term. Hopefully, that the Republican Party can be more serious about that.
Yeah, I think we need more rather than less of these kind of proposals. So people can see that we're serious about this. I mean, poll numbers show that most Americans are for some kind of paid family leave. So yeah, let's make it the most conservative policy, but let's also be insistent that and not make this just a one of those just symbolic proposals, which I don't think Romney's is. We have a question. This could be a big issue in Michigan in the fall with a ballot proposal on abortion. Any advice for common sense legislation that could be voted on before then to avoid the Kansasification of Michigan to the benefit of Democrats in other areas? Do you have any thoughts about that, John?
Yeah, I would think it would, especially in Michigan. Michigan is a state where it's it's a I would say a bluish state, even though it went for Donald Trump in 2016 narrowly, and then went for Joe Biden pretty decisively by a few percentage points for the exact margin in 2020. I think that's a place where you're going to want to focus on things like a 15-week pancake bobo. I think that would make a lot of sense in a place like Michigan. I haven't spoken to anyone on the ground there. I don't know what the case is. I do know that obviously Tudor Dixon, the nominee, she's been Democrats have hammered her for saying she opposes the exception in the case of rape. I think the principled way for people to say with that position, I mean, that was Paul Ryan's position. He was hammered over that in 2012 to say, my belief, I believe that every life has dignity. A life is a life is a life. It doesn't matter how you're conceived, but I'm willing to, I understand that the people of Michigan are not where I am. I want to forge a compromise. I want to come to a place where we can come together here and protect lives. Now, I might think it's perfect, but here's what I would do. I think it's not unprincipled to say that. It's realistic. It's pragmatic. That's politics. I think that you need to look to the great statesmen of someone even like Henry Hyde tolerated that exception in his legislation is amendment that stops federal funding of elective abortions and Medicaid. If he hadn't accepted that compromise, that amendment might have failed back in 1993, and hundreds of thousands of lives would not have been saved.
John, there's a question from Connecticut here. What do you think are the most effective ways for people in deep blue states to affect change? We support local pro-life pregnancy centers and directly help moms when we can. I also speak publicly about my own abortion experience, but I'm often speaking to groups in which most people are already pro-life. Here in Connecticut, I often feel like we're just trying to hold the line and keep the handful of pro-lifers from becoming pro-choice. And now our governor is working to make our state an abortion destination. I'm a New Yorker. I relate to that. One of the things I've been wanting to see, John, is a pro-life woman senator doing the reverse of what Elizabeth Warren is doing. Every week show up at a women's care center, stand with the Sisters of Life, tell the story, because you have a platform of what's really happening on the pro-life front lines, where people are actually meeting the needs of mothers and walking with them throughout, not abandoning them once they give birth.
Yeah, well, God bless our questioner for telling her story and for all the work she does. I would say, I'm a political reporter, but I would just say, keep on doing what you're doing. Don't be discouraged. Never give up. Every story you tell, you never know if you're telling some pro-lifer who is going to be inspired to go and do more great things and to go volunteer and to go work. And there are all sorts of different ways to protect life. I'm just a reporter. This is a part of my reporting. But there are people in all sorts of different walks of life who will find ways to, do art and and just living out their lives, volunteering at pregnancy centers. I would think that, yeah, places in Connecticut, just keep perspective that it was 50 years to get past Roe, and that this is likely a decades-long debate going forward still. So, if there are opportunities, that's a state where even taxpayer funding of abortion is there. But you see what opportunities you can, and don't feel like the world's on your shoulders. Everybody has their own gifts and their own place in life. And I would just say that's the most important thing is don't ever give up hope. Do what you can. Love women, love babies, keep telling the truth.
Well, and I often think when we think about these heartbeat bills, I often think of the partial birth abortion debate. And Rick Santorum tells a story about being on the floor of the Senate one night, not kind of knowing why he was doing that, calling in late, calling his wife and saying he'd be home late. And so I think he talked for an hour. And Dianne Feinstein was on the floor too, and there was some back and forth. And eventually, he gets a letter from someone who says that she was pregnant, and she and her boyfriend were watching, stopped on C-SPAN of all things, and she was going to go for an abortion, but because of what he was talking about, she talked to him, and they wound up having a child. But even just the language of partial birth abortion was a moment to talk about what's actually going on. I think heartbeat is another moment, but just even the mere fact that Roe was overturned, one of the things that gives me hope is that most people don't know what Roe was. We had that End Roe issue late last year where we went through the law and the science and what's been happening to women and the history. And this, I think, as you were saying, John, to our brave woman who asked the question, you never know what's going to happen, and this is a long-term investment. We have this opportunity now, as we talk about in the editorial, where we can shift policy, we can shift conversations, but in many cases, it's going to be a long-term thing. Having conversations about what's actually happening. A lot of people are confused, scared, as you were talking about earlier, even, medical language can confuse people about spontaneous abortion, which is not an abortion, right? But that's the medical language. And so there are definitely people of goodwill who, have reason to be uncertain. And part of what the long game here is, though it's certainly not a game, it's about human lives, is to patiently, lovingly talk about what really happens, talk about what the alternatives are, talk about the facts. Our political rhetoric makes it sound like it's middle class, women are empowered by abortion, when so often it's young girls, and so often it's Black and Hispanic girls, especially in New York. I'm not in New York right now, but more in some zip codes, more Black babies and Hispanic babies die in abortions than are born. That's not stuff that's well known. And so the more that we lovingly communicate that, the more we have a shot at changing the culture and thereby changing the politics, because I don't think you can change the politics without changing the culture.
Yeah, and one other point I like to make too, it's so easy to look at the enormity of abortion, look at the enormity, and the staggering numbers of abortion, hundreds of thousands per year. It's very easy to despair. It's very easy to look at that and just want to turn away, to be paralyzed, to think, I can't change this. I'm not going to stop this enormity, this enormous amount of death is just going to continue. But again, but then look at it the other way. I mean, if you just mentioned Rick Santorum giving a 10-minute speech that saved a life. I mean, most people in the course of their lives, how many lives do they save? How many lives do they save from being dismembered, destroyed? Most people don't save any lives. So if just think, if you spent your entire life, all of your efforts working through crisis pregnancy centers, it only saved one life, it would be worth it. I think that obviously you're going to save many more lives than just one. But just always keep hope that if it took 10 years to save one life, it would be worth it, and that would be if life is priceless, and it's definitely worth it.
I just noticed someone in the chat box said, "Do not demean women of color by calling them girls." I specifically used the word girls because in my time outside abortion clinics in New York, I see 17-year-old Black girls. They are girls. That's why so much of the rhetoric, I think, is so dangerous, because very often it's girls being pressured into having abortions, and so I just want to make clear that I wasn't trying to be demeaning. I was just describing what I see. One other question is, what is your prediction of the political landscape after the Kansas amendment failed, John?
Political landscape, meaning this November's election. I'm very bad at predictions. I don't know. I think that the most likely outcome still is that Republicans will keep the House, or take over the House, and that I think that there's been some real recruiting failures in the Senate on the Republican side, which makes control of the Senate very dicey for Republicans. Democrats could gain a seat, they could gain 2 seats. The nightmare scenario here for the pro-life cause, and the political nightmare scenario in the next couple of years, would be that Democrats gain 2 seats in the Senate and keep the House, have the presidency, and then they'll effectively enact their abortion through all 9 months bill called the Women's Health Protection Act, which is deceptively named. That they would enact taxpayer funding of abortion. That would be very bad. I mean, they were on the verge of doing that. They fell 2 seats short in 2020 of having the votes to do that, to get rid of the filibuster and enact this extreme abortion bill. So in a democracy, pro-lifers have to be prepared that things can get much worse before they can get better. But I don't know the exact outcome. I think that people are probably overreading it. Again, I mentioned that the state referendum analogy going back to Ohio, that didn't mean that that Scott Walker couldn't get reelected when he had a similar bill. So I do think that, but I do think there's a real question now, how much of a backlash there could be in November, especially in the early months right after this, when the disinformation, misinformation, confusion is at its peak. I think that's all the more reason for pro-lifers at every level, especially those in positions of power, clarify the law, that make it clear that women's lives, and when serious health issues are at play, standards of care should be exactly the same as they were before Dobbs.
And I also think it's important that politicians and everyone else need to be clear about what Roe versus Wade was, because there is a sense that there was this constitutional right that's been taken away. And as we've talked about with lawyers during this series, that's obviously not true. And obvious to us, it's not true, but not obvious to the majority of Americans, because polling shows us that most Americans have no idea that Roe allowed abortion in all 3 trimesters of pregnancy. Most Americans are not for abortion in all 3 trimesters of pregnancy, as we said earlier. John, as a political observer, reporting on these issues for decades now, what are just sort of your insights? I know you don't necessarily do advice, but going forward for Republican or pro-life politicians, let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, you have to define. You both have to. You need to highlight the extremists of the other side, while also being able to defend a positive pro-life agenda that has sufficient popular support. I mean, that's the nature of politics in a democracy. I mean, look to. I think Abraham Lincoln is our secular saint. He was very prudent in his, especially, his position was only merely that slavery could not be extended to the territories. And obviously the states, even then, he never denied that states had the ability to, before the Civil War, that they had the ability to either have slavery or not. He had this prudent, his goal was always, he phrased it as the ultimate extinction of slavery, that if you could confine it, certain states. That's obviously there are very big differences in terms of the 2 issues, while there are some similarities. But yes, to embrace principled incrementalism, that is not that is still operative, even that now that Roe is overturned. It's probably even more important to both to highlight the extremism on the other side, but also then to figure out, especially in your state, and just to make that clear that, you know, I believe every life is sacred, but here's a legislation that I will support. Here's a legislation that I will enact. I think that oftentimes there's a lot of desire, especially to appeal to the base, that you're worried about a Republican primary. You know, you don't want to have someone to get you right, but you need to think more of as a statesman. There needs to be pro-life statesmanship, you know, where you see the whole picture. You're not merely acting as a crass politician worried about re-election. You're not merely worried about how this will play in a primary. You're not merely trying to make the groups happy. I mean, that's kind of how you end up with, you know, Democrats going too far and supporting these bills that you know, there's no way that Chuck Schumer thinks this is a politically popular bill. Now, obviously, he's got the media helping him out, but I think there's, you know, you need to be principled and see the whole picture.
And I do also want to say that if you work in politics, you know, always be sensitive to the fact that there have been 64 million abortions in America since Roe versus Wade. So that means the audience you're talking to, even if it's a primary audience, a Republican primary audience, people have had abortions or been involved in abortions. And so be sensitive to that in your language, because you're not going to win anybody over if you're just pouring salt into their wounds. John McCormick, thank you so much. You can read his reporting on nationalreview.com and in the print magazine. If you don't subscribe, the link is on the website. And I thank you for joining us. This concludes our Fridays for Life series. I'm sure we'll have something else in the fall. Please keep your eye on and feel free to support the National Review Institute, nrinstitute.org.